It was Christmas Eve in the small, quiet town of Winterbrook, nestled deep in the snow-covered woods, where the holiday season always brought a sense of warmth and comfort. The air smelled of cinnamon and pine, and families gathered, exchanging gifts and laughter, preparing for the night of festive celebrations. It was the kind of place where neighbors helped one another, where the crackle of the fire and the glow of Christmas lights filled every home with joy. But for the Thompson family, this Christmas would be unlike any they had ever known. For years, Christmas had been a time of pure happiness for the Thompsons. Their home was always filled with love, twinkling lights on the tree, the sweet scent of gingerbread wafting from the kitchen, and the soothing sound of Christmas carols playing softly in the background. It was a place where, for a little while, all the worries of the world could be forgotten. Thomas and Mary, the parents, had built a life full of love and tradition, and their two children, Lily and her older brother Daniel, reveled in the warmth of those moments. But this year, something was different, something that could not be explained, something that sent a cold shiver down their spines. Lily, their youngest, had always been a bright and lively girl, her wide eyes full of wonder. But over the past week, she had become withdrawn. Her usually bright smile seemed forced, her laughter quiet and uncertain. She began to retreat to her room more often, and when she did speak, her voice was tinged with fear, her eyes constantly scanning the room as if she were waiting for something. At night, she began having strange dreams, dreams that left her waking up with a racing heart, drenched in sweat. In these dreams, an old man with hollow eyes and a twisted face would stand at the edge of her bed, his gaze cold and unblinking. He never moved, never spoke, just watched her. The sense of dread was overwhelming, as if the man could see into her very soul. Lily would wake, her breath shallow and quick, and find a single black feather resting on her pillow. At first, she thought it was just a nightmare, but after several nights in a row, she started to wonder if something more sinister was at play. She tried to tell her parents, but Thomas and Mary, though concerned, brushed it off.
"It's just the stress of the holiday season, sweetheart,"
her mother would say softly, tucking her back into bed.
"Everyone gets a little overwhelmed this time of year."
But Lily knew deep down that it wasn't just stress. The dreams felt too real, and the black feather, felt like a warning. She wasn't sure what it meant, but she could feel it in her bones. Something dark was watching her, waiting. One night, after her parents had tucked her in, and the house had fallen silent, Lily lay awake in her bed, staring into the darkness. She heard it then, scratching at the window. At first she thought it was just the wind, the trees swaying and scraping against the glass. But it wasn't. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding, her breath quickening. She crept to the window and pulled back the curtain. The snow was falling thick outside, blanketing the yard in a quiet white veil. But as she peered into the darkness, she saw nothing. Just the stillness of the snow-covered yard, untouched and silent. Her breath fogged up the glasses she exhaled, and for a moment she wondered if she had imagined it. But deep down, she knew she hadn't. Something had been out there, something that had made its presence known. The next morning, her parents found her staring at the window, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear.
"Lily, sweetheart, what's wrong?"
Her father said gently, kneeling beside her. But she couldn't explain it, couldn't find the words to describe the fear that gripped her heart. Her parents gave her comforting hugs, but neither of them could shake the feeling that something was wrong. The house felt colder, even though the fire in the living room burned brightly. Later that afternoon, as they all gathered by the fire, the Christmas tree casting a soft glow across the room, Lily's mother, Mary, glanced at her daughter and then at her husband. The warmth of the fire seemed to do little to thaw the icy feeling that had settled deep in their bones. For the first time, they felt it too, a sense that something was watching them, something waiting, just out of reach. On Christmas Eve, the Thompson family gathered around the fire, the room glowing with the soft flicker of candlelight and the comforting warmth of the hearth. The smell of pine and cinnamon lingered in the air as the snow gently fell outside, painting the world in shades of white and silver. The crackling of the fire was the only sound that filled the room, until Thomas, Lily's father, began to speak. It was a tradition, a time for storytelling, but tonight his voice seemed different, as if something darker was stirring within him. Lily sat on the edge of the couch, her fingers nervously twisting the hem of her sweater, her eyes fixed on her father. She had always loved these moments. Her father's deep voice, rich with warmth, sharing stories of Christmases past. But tonight, his words felt wrong, as if they didn't belong in this cheerful, festive setting.
I'm sure you all know the usual stories,
Thomas said, his voice low, his eyes distant.
but there's another tale, one my family has passed down through generations.
He hesitated, glancing at each of them, as if unsure whether he should continue. But then, as if compelled by some unseen force, he spoke again.
It's a legend that's haunted our family for years.
Lily's heart began to race. She'd never heard her father tell this story before, and there was something in his tone, something in his eyes, that made her feel uneasy. Her mother, Mary, shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her smile faltering. The warmth of the fire seemed to be slipping away, replaced by an icy chill that seemed to settle into the very bones of the house. Thomas continued, his voice growing quieter, more intense.
There's a man, a figure, who roams these woods during Christmas. Some call him Krampus, others simply call him the Christmas Wanderer. But whatever you call him, he is not a figure of joy. He's a monster, the spirit bound by ancient darkness. And every year, on Christmas Eve, he claims looking for families who have forgotten the true meaning of Christmas. He claims those who have strayed from the path of goodness.
Lily felt her breath catch in her throat. The words were so chilling, so alien to the happy Christmas stories she had heard growing up. Her eyes darted to her brother Daniel, who was sitting next to her. His face paled as he too seemed to sense the change in the room. The shadows cast by the firelight danced along the walls, growing longer, stretching like fingers reaching toward them. But then, something even stranger happened. The lights above them flickered, just a moment, but enough to make their hearts skip a beat. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, the warmth of the fire no longer comforting, but somehow distant, as if the very air around them was turning cold. Lily shivered, her skin prickling with unease. She could feel the darkness pressing in, closing around them. The air seemed heavier, thicker, as if something unseen was watching them. Her father's voice continued, now strained, as if he wasn't in control of what he was saying.
Comes on the wind with the jingling of bells and the heavy crunch of boots in the snow.
The hairs on the back of Lily's neck stood on end. It was a sound she knew well, an unmistakable sound. Jingling bells. At first, she thought it was her imagination, the wind perhaps carrying some distant noise from outside, but then it grew louder, clearer. The faint sound of bells ringing softly, as if from a distance. And then, slowly, it became more pronounced, closer. She could hear the unmistakable crunching of heavy boots on snow, their slow, deliberate steps drawing nearer with each passing second. Lily's pulse quickened. Her eyes darted to the window, her breath fogging up the glass as she pressed her face against it. The yard was blanketed in thick snow, the dark silhouettes of trees standing still in the night. But as she watched, her breath catching in her throat, she saw something, a shadow moving through the snow, slowly at first, then faster, like the heavy, deliberate steps of someone or something coming toward them. She turned to her parents, her voice barely a whisper. Thomas's face was ashen, his eyes wide. He didn't respond. He couldn't. The sound outside grew louder, the jingling of bells and the crunch of snow now unmistakable, undeniable. And then, with a sudden gust of cold air, the door to the house creaked open. Lily's heart raced as the door swung wide, despite being locked. The room fell into an eerie silence, the fire crackling weakly as if it too was afraid. The temperature dropped so quickly that Lily could see her breath forming in the air. The shadows seemed to grow darker, stretching out like long, grasping fingers. The man in the legend, the one her father had spoken of, was outside, and he was coming closer. Lily's mother, Mary, sat frozen in her chair, her hand gripping the armrest so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The noise outside had stopped, but the unsettling feeling in the room only intensified. She could still hear the heavy crunch of boots in the snow, but now it was replaced by a quiet, almost unnatural stillness. As the family sat in fear, the temperature in the room continued to plummet, making the fire in the hearth feel like nothing more than a faint memory of warmth. With a shudder, Mary forced herself to move. She had to look. She had to know what was out there, even though every instinct screamed at her to stay away from the window, to ignore the growing fear gnawing at her gut. Slowly, she rose, her legs trembling beneath her, and moved toward the window. She parted the curtains just enough to peer outside. The snow was falling thick and fast, obscuring much of the yard, but there, through the swirling white mist, she saw him. A figure, tall and hunched, walking with a deliberate, unsettling pace through the snow. His coat was torn and ragged, stained with what Mary could only guess was age and the passage of time. But what stopped her breath was his eyes. They glowed with an unnatural light, like two embers glowing in the cold night. She couldn't move, she couldn't breathe. The man's face was obscured by a dark hood, casting him in shadow, but there was something wrong about him, something she couldn't put her finger on. As the figure came closer, the temperature in the room dropped further, colder than she had ever felt. A sharp gust of wind suddenly swept through the house, blowing out the candles on the mantel, leaving them in complete darkness. The room fell silent. No one spoke. No one moved. They could hear the man's labored breathing outside, and then, just as suddenly as the wind had picked up, it stopped. The door to the house creaked open, despite being locked. A chill, so intense it made their breath freeze in the air, swept into the room, and they could feel the weight of his presence, looming just beyond the door. Mary couldn't tear her eyes away from the doorway. The figure, now standing in the threshold, stepped inside. His breath was visible in the freezing air, curling up like smoke. His tall, hunched figure filled the doorframe, casting a long, menacing shadow across the room. He moved with an unnatural slowness, his boots making no sound as he crossed the threshold. Mary's heart pounded in her chest, her mind screaming at her to run, but her body refused to obey. She couldn't take her eyes off him. The figure's voice broke the silence, low and raspy, like the scraping of bone on bone.
"Who's been naughty this year?"
he croaked, his words hanging in the air like a curse. The family froze, each of them paralyzed with terror. Lily's breath hitched in her throat as she backed away from the figure, but her feet felt like they were cemented to the floor. Her father, Thomas, who had always been the protector, couldn't find his voice. Mary could feel the weight of his gaze on her, but she couldn't bring herself to look away from the man who stood before them. She felt as if her body was frozen in place, her limbs betraying her as she stared at the monstrous figure now inside their home. The man's eyes burned into hers, and she could feel them piercing through her, seeing things no one should ever see. His gaze was hollow, yet filled with malice, as if he knew the darkest secrets of her soul. He stepped forward slowly, his movements deliberate, his ragged breath filling the silence of the room. The family could only watch in horrified disbelief as he took another step closer.
Did you think you could escape me?
The man's voice was like a death knell, sending chills down their spines. His presence was suffocating, and the air around them felt thick with an oppressive force. The man's face, still hidden beneath his hood, tilted slightly as he surveyed the family. His body seemed to bend unnaturally, like a twisted marionette, moving without purpose. His tattered red coat billowed around him, moving in ways that didn't match the stillness of the air. It was as if the very fabric of the world around him was bending to his will. Lily's eyes darted around the room, desperate to find an escape. Her breath was shallow, her heart racing faster than ever before. She could hear her family's panicked breathing, but everything felt distant, frozen in time. Her mother was still staring at the man, her face pale and frozen with fear. Her father's hands were shaking at his sides, unable to reach for a weapon, unable to do anything. The figure moved again, this time toward Lily. His steps were slow, dragging, but every inch closer felt like an eternity. Lily couldn't tear her eyes away from him, couldn't find the strength to look away. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body was paralyzed by the suffocating terror that gripped her. The figure was now inches from her, his breath cold against her skin.
I've been watching you,
he whispered, his voice laced with darkness.
You all belong to me now.
The man stepped forward, and as he did, Lily's heart skipped a beat, her breath caught in her throat. The figure in front of her wasn't just a stranger, wasn't just some eerie figure. It was something far worse. The man before her was a twisted, monstrous version of Santa Claus, his once jolly face now an abomination. His skin was decayed and sagging, flesh hanging off in places like rotting paper. His eyes, hollow, empty pits, seemed to pierce through her very being, as if they could see every fear, every secret she had ever held. It was as if he knew her soul, and she was certain it wasn't a good thing. Lily's chest tightened. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The air around her felt thick with dread, as though the very room was closing in. Her legs felt weak, but she couldn't look away from those eyes, cold, empty, and filled with a darkness that consumed everything in its path. The figure's lips twisted into a grotesque smile, a smile that didn't belong on a man or anything human. His voice was a low, menacing hiss that seemed to reverberate in the very marrow of her bones.
Did you think Christmas was all about gifts?
He sneered, his voice hoarse, like sandpaper scraping against stone.
It's about taking what's been promised to me.
Lily's stomach churned. Her hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the couch, trying to hold on to something, anything, to steady herself. Her father, Thomas, who had always been the protector, the strong one, now looked like a shell of the man he had been moments before. His eyes were wide with terror, his breath shallow. Without warning, Thomas dropped to his knees, his body collapsing as though the very life had been drained from him. His face turned ghostly pale, his hands trembling as he gasped for air, as though something invisible had a hold of him, squeezing the life from him. The family could only watch in horror, helpless. The room grew colder still, colder than it had ever been. The fire in the hearth flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The Christmas tree, once a symbol of warmth and joy, now stood like a twisted mockery. The lights blinked out, one by one, and the ornaments began to tremble, rattling on the branches as if they were alive. Then, with a sickening crack, the tree collapsed to the floor, its branches scattering and the glass ornaments shattering like 1,000 tiny explosions. The sound of the crash echoed through the house, deafening in the silence that followed. Lily's breath was ragged. The air felt heavy, suffocating. And still, the man, this twisted version of Santa Claus, advanced on her, his eyes locked onto hers with a hunger that made her blood run cold. He was close now, too close, and his foul breath sent a chill straight to her core. The room seemed to grow darker, the shadows pulling in tighter, as if the house itself was alive, consuming her in the darkness. The man reached into his coat, his hands moving with unnatural slowness, like he was savoring every moment of the terror he was inflicting. Lily's pulse raced in her ears as she realized what he was holding: a black feather, a strange, twisted thing, wound tight in his bony fingers. It glimmered with an unnatural sheen, and Lily felt an overwhelming sense of dread rise in her chest as he brought it closer to her.
"You have something I want, child,"
the man whispered, his voice so soft, so quiet, that it sent a shiver crawling up Lily's spine. The words felt like a promise. No, a threat. She didn't know what he meant, but her instincts screamed that whatever it wasn't good. Before she could move, before she could even scream, the world around her seemed to implode. Darkness swallowed her whole, and the last thing she heard was the rasp of the man's breath, the words,
"You belong to me now,"
echoing in her ears. Then, nothing. Silence. Total darkness. The Christmas Eve that had once been filled with warmth, with the light of the tree and the laughter of her family, was now nothing but an empty, frozen void. Lily's world, her very reality, seemed to shatter into pieces, as if the darkness had consumed not just her, but everything she had known and loved. The next morning, the quiet of the house was almost deafening. The usual warmth of Christmas morning was absent, replaced by a cold, eerie silence that hung in the air like a heavy fog. The sun, pale and distant, shone through the windows, casting long, thin shadows across the room. The outside world seemed untouched, the snow still blanketing the earth. But inside, there was no sign of the holiday cheer that had once filled their home. Thomas awoke first, his eyes snapping open, his breath shallow and erratic. He felt wrong. He couldn't place it, but there was an unsettling emptiness in the air. He blinked, trying to push away the remnants of the nightmare from his mind. The nightmare that had felt so real, so consuming. He turned to look at Mary, still asleep beside him, her face pale in the dim morning light. She looked peaceful, but there was a deep sadness in the way her chest rose and fell. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Lily. His heart skipped a beat as his eyes searched the room. Her absence hit him like a punch to the gut, a cold, paralyzing realization. The place where she had slept was empty. The bed was perfectly made, the covers neatly tucked in, but there was no sign of Lily. No soft breathing, no rustling sheets, nothing.
"Lily?"
His voice cracked, barely a whisper, but the word hung in the air, heavy with fear. There was no response. His body moved on instinct, propelled by the primal need to find his daughter. He rushed through the house, calling her name, but the silence was deafening. He passed the empty kitchen, the untouched breakfast, and then into the living room, where his gaze fell on the fallen Christmas tree. His heart skipped once more, and his breath hitched. There, beneath the tree, surrounded by the shattered remains of the ornaments, lay something so out of place that it sent a chill straight through his spine. A single black feather. Its dark, twisted shape gleamed unnaturally in the daylight, as if it was not of this world. Thomas's hands trembled as he crouched down to pick it up, the weight of it somehow heavier than it should have been. He felt a cold shiver run down his spine as his fingers closed around it. It was real, solid, but everything about it was wrong. He could feel the air growing colder as he held it, and his mind raced, trying to understand. Where was Lily? What had happened? Had it all been a dream? Or had something far darker taken her from them? Suddenly the door creaked open behind him. He whipped around, but there was nothing there. Just the empty hallway, the echo of his own breath filling the space. Panic surged within him. His thoughts scattered, racing in every direction. He needed to find her. He needed to know that she was okay. He spun back to the living room, his gaze frantic as he scanned every corner. His mind refused to believe it, the impossible truth that his daughter was gone, taken by something that shouldn't exist. His mind raced back to the night before, the horrifying figure at their door, the creature who had called out to them, who had said, "You belong to me now." His throat tightened as he realized that the man, the monster, was real. And Lily, his little girl, was no longer part of this world. Mary's voice, a hoarse whisper, broke through his thoughts. She stood in the doorway, her eyes hollow, filled with the same terror that gripped his heart. She, too, had felt the absence, the emptiness where Lily's laughter should have been.
Ton.
Her voice trailed off as she looked at the feather in his hand. Her eyes widened, terror and grief overtaking her. She stepped into the room, her hands trembling as she reached out, as if trying to grasp something solid, something real in the midst of the nightmare.
This isn't real.
She whispered, but even as she spoke, she knew. She knew it was. The black feather, the absence of their daughter. It was all too much, too impossible to deny.
Where is she?
Mary whispered, her voice breaking.
Where is our daughter?
Thomas couldn't answer. There were no words that could explain what had happened, no comfort to offer in this nightmare that had unfolded around them. Suddenly, there was a sound, soft, almost imperceptible, like the faintest rustle of fabric in the wind. Thomas's heart lurched. He turned, his eyes scanning the room, the air thick with tension. There, just beyond the shadowed corner, stood a figure. Lily! She stood there, her eyes wide and empty, staring at them from the edge of the room. But she wasn't herself. The once bright, innocent spark of joy in her eyes was gone. Instead, they were hollow, dark, like the eyes of the man who had taken her. She stood motionless, as if she were nothing more than a shell of the little girl they had known. Mary gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, but Thomas felt a deep, suffocating sense of dread settle into his chest. This wasn't their Lily.
She's not ours anymore,
he whispered, his voice breaking. The figure moved closer, but as it did, the temperature in the room dropped even further. The shadows seemed to grow longer, darker, as if they were alive, stretching out toward them. The faintest trace of a whisper escaped Lily's lips, a word, barely audible, but unmistakable.
Help me!
But before Thomas could reach out, the darkness swallowed her whole, and in that instant, she was gone. All that remained was the faint scent of pine and cinnamon, the remnants of a Christmas Eve that would haunt them forever.